With some of these longer passages, I felt bad asking people to get up and read them. So I may still, I think we're going to do all of chapter 21 in 1 week, if anybody wants to take that one on. I think that's the longest passage that we'll have. I'm going to go ahead and pray. We're going to get into the Word. God, thank you for your Word. We submit ourselves to it today. Thank you for your goodness and your grace that brings us here today. Thank you that we can worship you together. Thank you for your assembled body, both here in this small church and also all over Chico, where there are believers who are gathered together, lifting up worship to you. God, preaching your gospel, coming before you in praise and thanksgiving. God, we join with them, and God, we give you thanks. In Jesus' name, amen. How does a people lose its way? How do hearts stray from God? How does one's love grow cold? How does one accommodate and allow the worship of false gods? As we get started today, I want to introduce you to a rough framework for approaching the section of the Bible that we're looking at. We're doing this study in the book of 1 Kings, and there's some things that I want to kind of help you to maybe understand about this. So the first 5 books of the Bible, if you're familiar with them, the Pentateuch, also known as the books of the law or the books of Moses, are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And I do believe in the authorship of those books, primarily by Moses, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. The book of Deuteronomy is a little bit different than the 4 that comes before it. It summarizes and it reiterates some things that had happened before and things that had been taught before. So it takes those things and kind of condenses them down, especially the events since the Exodus at the beginning of the book of Exodus. Deuteronomy does end with the death of Moses being described, which keys us into the fact that Moses didn't write the entire book. And so there were was another author or authors involved in putting that together. And then when we get into the next chunk of books in the Bible, many biblical scholars identify this block of books of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings, having been either authored or compiled by the same authors, the same group. There is a cohesive narrative for all of these books. And one of the main things that they consistently do throughout these books is they use the book of Deuteronomy as a framework and a lens that they are presenting this part of narrative history through. In Deuteronomy, God's promises and his cautions to his covenant people, they're clearly laid out. Keep your heart of worship fixed on Yahweh. Live in accordance with that, and you will stay in right relationship. You'll stay in right relationship with God. You will stay in right relationship with your brothers and sisters. If you allow your heart to stray, if you go and start to worship other gods, your conduct that follows will be wicked, it will be evil, it will be contrary to the ways of God, and that relationship with God will be breached, and it will also impact your relationship with your brothers and sisters, the people around you. And then also, God will discipline you. God will discipline you to bring you back. The things taught to the original audience in Deuteronomy were very clearly supposed to be passed from one generation to the next. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 2, I've got up there, says that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son's son, by keeping all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you all the days of your life, that your days may be long. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, I didn't know how well, this is a bigger passage, I didn't know how well you'd be able to see it up there. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. This commandment there in Deuteronomy 6 is also reiterated almost word for word in Deuteronomy chapter 11. Same instruction. And then at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy 30, which I've got a slide for that one too, Luke. Deuteronomy 30, starting in verse 15. Moses is laying out kind of everything that's come before, and he is reiterating to the people of Israel, "See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you today by loving the Lord your God, by walking in his ways, and by keeping his commandments and his statutes and his rules, then you shall live and multiply, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to take possession of. But if your heart turns away, and you will not hear, but are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not live long in the land that you're going over the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore choose life, that you and your offspring may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying his voice and holding fast to him, for he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give them." So we can see the arc of the various sequences that follow from Joshua through 2 Kings, where Israel stays in a place of faithful worship to Yahweh and where they do not. And they go back and forth between these many times. There are some major points in the narrative where we see that there is a failure to pass things from one generation to the next, a failure to do what was commanded in Deuteronomy 6 and Deuteronomy 11. So one of the points of that we see is Joshua and his generation. They entered into the promised land. They drove out most of the nations that they were supposed to drive out there, but not all of them. But they did stay faithful to worship of Yahweh during the time that Joshua was leading the nation of Israel. But there was some failure because we get to the end of Joshua, and then we start the book of Judges, and things are really terrible, and they go downhill. And there's the change of a generation there, from Joshua's generation to this next generation. They did not pass on to the next generation the things that they were living, the things they knew, the things that they were obeying. And so what happened was the next generation completely strayed in worship, and the resulting conduct is just horrible. So if you read through the book of Judges, there is just this continual descent towards more and more wickedness. And the result from God is that in love we see that he disciplines his people. Over and over again, he has means of discipline to draw them back to himself. In the book of 1 Samuel, we see that under King David, there was worship of Yahweh alone. There was no other idol worship that was allowed in the nation of Israel. But again, there was a major failure that took place because when David passed the reign on to his son Solomon, Solomon lived for a while, loving and serving God. He built the temple. He was living in this place of obedience to the one true God and not allowing any other participation in worship of idols. But then he married foreign women, allowed in the worship of these other gods. First, it is accommodation, and then we see towards the end of his life, it's actually participation in this false worship. So something was lost between David and Solomon. It wasn't passed on the way that it should be. When we get to King Ahab and Elijah, we see that this pattern is still playing out. So Ahab himself, King Ahab, is not in David's line. You'll remember he's part of the rebellious northern kingdom of Israel. But this nation is still part of the covenant people, still part of the nation of Israel. And the author is still pointing out how the options presented of either life or death are things that are playing out through the leadership of this country and then from the leadership down into the populace of the country. Worship God and him alone, and you are choosing life. Allow the worship of false gods, these evil spirits, and you are choosing death. Okay, we're going to turn our attention to our passage here, 1 Kings 18. What was read on that Streetlights Bible, they do the New Living Translation. So there is a few things, probably won't remember word for word what was said in that, but we're going to be looking at the ESV as we're doing it today. As we turn our attention to 1 Kings 18, we've reached the point in the narrative, if you recall a couple chapters before, Elijah had given the word of the Lord that there would be no rain in the land until he said it, until Elijah again proclaimed that there would be rain in the land. And now we see that the word of the Lord has come to Elijah. Verse 1 came to Elijah, and it tells him, you're supposed to go and show yourself to Ahab. We're told in verse 3 that the famine was severe in Samaria, and as we saw last week, this lack of rain affected the northern kingdom of Israel, and then also the kind of land north of that where Elijah had been hanging out with the widow of Zarephath. So Ahab calls on a man in his household by the name of Obadiah to help him search around the land to find water and grass and perhaps keep some of their livestock and animals alive. We're introduced in verse 3 to this guy, Obadiah, and this narrative in 1 Kings 18 is the only time we read about him. Okay, so a little bit about him, a couple things here. He's not the prophet Obadiah with the book of the same name that we have in the Old Testament. There's actually 4 different Obadiahs that are found throughout, scattered around throughout the Old Testament, and we can tell that they're all different based on when they lived and the reign of the kings that they lived during. So apparently more common name than we might think. But this guy was in the household of King Ahab. He had a very high position, and this means that he was trusted by Ahab. Despite the fact that Ahab is leading in a manner which is completely in rebellion to Yahweh, we're told in the parenthetical statement in verse 3 that Obadiah feared the Lord greatly. Obadiah feared the Lord greatly. Obadiah himself later reiterates this to Elijah in the interaction that he has with him. So we see that the fact that he feared the Lord greatly resulted in him acting in a particular way. So when Ahab and Jezebel were searching for the prophets of Yahweh to kill them, Obadiah actually took steps to hide away 100 of them in 2 different caves to take them food, to take them water, to provide for them, provide for their safety. The forward motion of the narrative here is heading towards what we're going to look at next week, which is this confrontation between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. And Elijah, you can tell here in this passage, that's where his mind is. He goes pretty quickly to that. So the last few verses of our section set up that confrontation. It's this interaction between Elijah and Ahab. But this interaction with Obadiah that happens in the middle, the actions of Obadiah himself, are something that I think is worthwhile to take time, look specifically at, and give attention to. Before we do that, we're going to skip to the last part of this section and look at that confrontation between Elijah and Ahab. So next slide here, starting in verse 17, Ahab and Elijah meet and they exchange insults. Ahab has been scouring the nation of Israel as well as the nations around, looking for Elijah. And here he is. They're finally face to face, and Ahab is really mad. So, verse 17, when Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" And what he's doing here, what he's saying here, is he's accusing Elijah of bringing a curse on Israel. So clearly this lack of rain here is very, very bad for the nation. If it's impacting the king's livestock, you know that the way that it would be impacting the populace is very severe. And Ahab is in a pretty desperate situation because he has no power over the rain here. And he attributes this to Elijah, because Elijah is the one who proclaimed, it's not going to rain again until I give my word. And so he's the one to blame. What's fascinating here when we look at Ahab is he's not attributing this to Yahweh. He's not attributing this to the one true God. He's attributing the lack of rain to Elijah in particular. And Elijah responds, verse 18 says, "And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandment of the Lord and followed the Baals. You and your family," pointing back to Ahab's father Omri, who did the same thing, idol worship, all of that stuff, was more evil than all the kings who came before him. He says, you and your family are responsible for this curse that is currently on the land. So is there any basis here for the statement that Elijah makes that he's responsible for this? So we're going to head back over to the book of Deuteronomy, because this is one of those things where the authors here, they're tying things together very clearly. Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 13 to 17. Commandments to the nation of Israel. And if you will indeed obey my commandments that I command you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and all your soul, he will give you the rain for your land in its season, the early rain and the latter rain, that you may gather in your grain and your wine and your oil, and he will give you grass in your fields for your livestock, and you shall eat and be full. Take care lest your heart be deceived, and you turn aside and serve other gods, and worship them. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain, and the land will yield no fruit, and you will perish quickly off the good land that the Lord is giving you. Well, that sounds pretty on the nose here to the situation that they're experiencing, right? This is part of God's covenant with his people. He made it really clear. If you stay within this place of worshiping me, Yahweh, and me alone, you will continue in this place of receiving rain, and there will be fruit in the land. If you stray and you worship other gods, there will be consequences. Take care lest your heart be deceived. The sequence of events that we see under Ahab and under his father is that they first allow in, and then they are participating themselves in the worship of these false gods, in the worship of these evil spirits. God has cut off the rain, so who's the real troubler here? Who's the one that is causing this? It's Ahab, and through him, it's impacting the nation, and as the nation strays, then God is reacting in discipline. So did Ahab have no knowledge of this? Was he ignorant of the writings in Deuteronomy? Is this one of those things where he really could just kind of plead, I didn't know that was in there? I think we don't know for sure. It's possible. It's possible that he had not heard this, not been taught this at all. But I did want to point out where this happens in the history of kind of the United Kingdom under David and Solomon, and then the divided kingdom. This is only 57 years since Solomon died. This isn't a long time. This is still within a lifetime of when Solomon, who had been faithful to Yahweh, at least for part of his life, when he lived. There's a story of King Josiah, if you guys remember the story of King Josiah. And as I'm thinking about the kings, I can get them kind of mixed up as where they fit in the whole sequence and everything. King Josiah came to the throne when he was 8 years old. And later in his life, he orders his people to go and search through the temple. And while they're searching, they find the book of the law. And they bring the book of the law out, and they read it to him, and he's astounded because these are things that he didn't know. And then they read it for the nation, and they're astounded, and everybody weeps and repents, and they clean out the idol worship in the nation. And this was actually in the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom. So I can take that kind of story, and I can go, well, clearly they were forgetting things. But that one happened 300 years after Solomon died. So, think about 1724. How many things do you remember or know about without reading history and having things passed on? This is something where that had happened a long time before. With Ahab here, I don't think that he can plead ignorance. I don't think that he can claim that he didn't know about what was taught in Deuteronomy. I think he was ignoring it. It had been ignored by his father Omri, and then it was being ignored by him. That this was still available, that it was still being taught, is evidenced by the fact that right in his household, Obadiah was obeying. He was obeying Yahweh. He was worshiping the one true God. Also, God had sent the prophet Elijah to Ahab to confront him and convict him of these things, to call him back to worship of Yahweh. But what we see at this point in the story is Ahab is completely hardened to this. If you compare these two passages, it's pretty fascinating. I think that this is an indicator that the author of 1 Kings is pointing to things in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 11 specifically says, "He will give grass in your field for your livestock, and you shall eat and be full. 1 Kings 18:5. Ahab said to Obadiah, "Go through the land to all the springs of water and to all the valleys. Perhaps we may find grass and save the horses and mules alive and not lose some of the animals." God has promised, I'm going to give you grass, I'm going to give you water, I'm going to do all the things to take care of your animals. Over here, Ahab, in rebellion, is saying, we're going to go, we're going to scour the land, we're going to try to find this on our own. So I think it's a clear indicator of where he was at, where his heart was at. So what we have from here in the sequence is we're going to have the confrontation where Elijah says, all right, bring the prophets of Baal, and we're going to meet on Mount Carmel, and we're going to see that next week, which I'm looking forward to. For today, though, we're going to turn our attention back to Obadiah. In this interaction between Obadiah and Elijah, starting in verse 7 of our chapter, we see that he's extremely grateful to find that Elijah is alive. So he falls on his face. Is it you, my Lord, Elijah? But what we get in the narrative here is that Elijah's not really thinking about Obadiah's feelings a lot. He just kind of runs over him. He gets right to the point. He says, "It is I. Go tell your Lord, behold, Elijah is here." So he's all business here. He's a man on a mission. Obadiah hears Elijah's instruction to go tell Ahab, and he is immediately filled with fear. "What have I done that you want me to die?" is his response to Elijah. Now, when I look at this passage, there's a couple things I wonder. Why did Elijah not just ask Obadiah where Ahab was at? Like, he could, get directions. Obviously, Obadiah knew where he was at. He was able to go find him and bring him back. Elijah could just go, "Hey, where's he at? Tell me, and I'll go and find Ahab." Is this intended for Obadiah to grow in some fashion? I think the answer is probably yes. It's not entirely clear how we can see that. We don't get the specifics here. But we do see that Obadiah is assuming that if he goes and retrieves Ahab, between the time that he leaves Elijah's presence and comes back to where he was at, God's going to whisk Elijah away and hide him again, and then Obadiah is going to show up with Ahab. Ahab's going to be enraged, and he's going to take his life. So Obadiah declares to Elijah, he talks about his faithfulness. "I have feared the Lord from my youth." And then he says, "Has it not been told, my Lord, what I did? How I took care of 100 of the Lord's prophets, hiding them away and feeding them." So I think this is kind of funny because I think Obadiah was not proclaiming these actions that he was doing. He wouldn't want Ahab to find out about it, or anybody in the kingdom who was faithful to Ahab. So maybe he's assuming that God told Elijah directly about these things. "Haven't you heard about what I've been doing for the prophets?" Elijah's response is short and to the point. In verse 15, Elijah said, as the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to him today. I will surely show myself to Ahab today. So he assures Obadiah, "I'm going to hang out here. I'm going to be here until you come back with Ahab." He doesn't comment on Obadiah's faithfulness, on the actions that he said for the second time here in the narrative that's been told about him. He just gives this oath before Yahweh that he won't go anywhere. So Obadiah believes him, he complies, he goes and gets Ahab and brings him back. Now, while Elijah's not particularly interested because he has his mind set on the things that are coming next, I think that we should pay attention to what Obadiah did here. We should look at it and kind of think about it a little bit further. Accounts like this, where Obadiah saved the 100 prophets, they're an important example of how we should live, and we have several of them in the Scripture, so I think we should take note of them. We learn from the Word of God how we should conduct ourselves should we find ourselves in a variety of different circumstances. We need to consider what the Bible teaches us, and we need to prepare ahead of time for how we would act if we were to be found in a similar type of circumstances here. What do you do if you're in a society that decides that it is right to persecute or kill a particular group of people? What do you do if a government imposes laws which are contrary to the morality of God? And these aren't really abstract questions, because we know as we look around the world, there's governments all over the place which are persecuting particular groups of people, which are imposing laws which are contrary to the morality of God. There's places around the world where there's particular ethnicities which are targeted, which are called out, and it's not just Christians either. If you look at the country of China, there's been government-sanctioned atrocities against the Uyghur people there, which is a Muslim group of people, and that's been happening for a number of years. So those people, they're worshiping a false god. They're not of us. We would look at people who are of that religion. We'd say they're not of us, but throughout church history, what we've seen is that the Christian ethic is to protect those who are being discarded, neglected, persecuted, even if they are not Christians, even if they're not of us. This is done because we believe that all people have been created in the image of God, that all are worthy of dignity and respect and care and protection. We don't just reserve that for people who are Christians. So we saw this time and time again during World War II when Christians protected and saved Jewish people, even though those Jews might not believe in Jesus. They weren't part of the Christian faith. So in Obadiah's case here, what we see is Obadiah defied the wishes of the government, those who were in charge, in order to preserve the life of those who were actually being persecuted because they were prophets of Yahweh. So he was protecting people who were part of the faithful people of God. But in situations like the Hebrew midwives in Exodus 1, if you recall the story there, the government in Egypt said all of the male children need to be thrown into the Nile River. The Hebrew midwives said, we're not going to do this. And they rebelled against that immoral law from the government. So they were Hebrew babies that they were saving, but it wasn't based on who those children would grow up to be. And actually, we know that those children, they were part of the generation of Moses. So they grew up. That's part of the generation who was out in the wilderness. Were all the people of Israel, all the Hebrews who were out in the wilderness, were they all faithful to God? No. They built golden calves, and they rebelled, and they did all kinds of stuff. They ended up having a number of different people. And we don't know the identity of what babies were saved along with Moses. So this wasn't based on who they would grow up to be or their conduct or their faithfulness or anything like that. It was based on the fact that these babies are made in the image of God. They're worthy of dignity and respect in life. They're worthy of protection. I think it's important to note that this type of service in the preservation of life is a witness, which as Christians, we sincerely hope and pray leads to a person being brought into the kingdom of God. So the preaching of the gospel is absolutely a part of what we would want to do in extending any sort of love and protection to people who are being persecuted. But the beliefs of the people who we're doing that for is essentially irrelevant. That's not one of the criteria that we would use to determine if a person is worthy of being protected or not. So we see another situation like Obadiah's in the book of Joshua, chapter 2, when Rahab protects the spies who have come there to search out the city of Jericho. Rahab showed that she believed in Yahweh to be the one true God, and in obedience to what she knew to be righteous before him, she hid the spies away, even though that was contrary to the specific interests of the government that she was living under. In Hebrews chapter 11, she is praised for the faith that she demonstrated there. In 1 Samuel 20, we read about Jonathan. He's the son of King Saul. He is essentially the heir to the throne. And instead of protecting himself or his father or the government or the things that are being laid down, he protects David. He protects David because he knows that David is the chosen one to lead the nation of Israel next. So he did this because he knew it would be righteous before God, even though it was contrary to the government. So in all three of these accounts, just like the account of Obadiah, we see that they risked their own lives. They put their own lives on the line in order to preserve the lives of others. And in keeping with what we read in Deuteronomy in chapter 6 and chapter 11, we're supposed to declare these things. We're supposed to pass them on to our children. We're supposed to let our children know about these things. And so we're doing that today. This is one of those things where I want everybody in here, all the kids in here, to know this is how Christians live. This isn't something that we're at this point in the country that we live in and the city that we live in where we're having to make these decisions on a daily basis. We may never actually find ourselves in a situation where this extreme of a interaction is necessary, where we're having to hide people away in order to protect them from persecution. But that may be something that happens during our lifetime. It may be something that happens during our children's lifetime. And so I want the kids who are in here to be able to think back, and if it's 50 years from now, and there's a situation that arises, you can go, I remember I was taught when I was young that it is consistent with being a Christian to protect others, even if that is something that puts my life in danger, puts me in harm. If we fail to actually teach these things and point out that these are the examples that the Bible gives us of those who acted in a righteous and God-honoring way, why would we expect our children to grow up and to know these things? This isn't something that we're just going to get because it occurs to us. There's also numerous historical stories outside of the Bible since the time of Jesus of how Christians have lived this ethic out over the centuries. There's a story of St. Agnes of Rome in the 3rd century, St. Alban in Britain in the 3rd century. One that stood out was St. Sebastian, also in the 3rd century. He was a Roman soldier, and he was secretly a Christian. So he used his position within the military leadership of Rome to protect Christians, and he actually also engaged in breaking them out of prison and getting them free. He ended up being arrested and martyred for the things that he did in protecting these other believers. There's accounts of multiple monasteries over 1,000 years around the world who provided shelter and protection in times of war and conflict. And what's consistent among those monasteries is they did it regardless of the religion or creed of the people who were being persecuted. So there's times when they protected Muslims, there's times when they protected other religions, where they would take people in and they would protect them because they were human beings, and it wasn't about what religion they were. In more modern history, we have stories like those of Harriet Tubman. She was a woman who was born into slavery in the 19th century, who escaped and then returned to rescue and guide other slaves to freedom. Her actions were motivated by her faith in God. Her actions were motivated by the fact that she believed in God, she was hearing from Him, and she was living out her faith. There's the famous story I think a lot of us probably know about Corrie ten Boom during World War II. She and her family hid away Jews and were able to help Jews to escape from the persecution of the Nazi government. And they did this at the risk of their own freedom, their own lives. They did this, Corrie ten Boom and her family, because they knew Jesus, they knew the Bible, they knew that God called on them to protect others who were under wrongful persecution by the government. Particularly in that situation, in that story, we see that this was something that was an ethic which was held by Corrie ten Boom and her sister's father, and it was passed on to them, and all of them participated in that together. So these stories from history over the last few thousand years reflect the stories we see in biblical history. This has been a continuous ethic of the true Church of Christ. But during the time of World War II, we also see that there were many, especially within the state church in Germany, who were not being taught the truth and who did not engage in the protection of others. In fact, there's many accounts which show that they were either completely passive to what was happening around them, or even complicit in the wicked actions of the German government. So how could that happen? How could those churches lose it so badly? How is it possible that they would be able to sit there, and there's the stories of them sitting in their worship service, which are being disrupted by the sound of the train whistles that are carrying people away to concentration camps. How can you sit there while that's happening? Well, the same thing that was being warned about in the book of Deuteronomy was played out there. The worship of the one true God faded, and the worship of other gods increased. In Germany at that point in time, if you're aware of kind of church history and theological history, in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, there was the rise of theological liberalism in Germany. There was more and more of this, we don't really believe that the Bible is true. We don't really believe that this is literal. This is all figurative. This is kind of indicating how we should live. And there was a straying from the truth over and over and over again. The worship of the one true God faded. The gods for them of intellectualism and philosophy and even prosperity rose up and took the place of the worship of God. So we're going to be getting into this a little bit more in weeks to come. Idol worship and false gods, all of that. This has not gone away, but it has morphed and changed. So within groups like the German state church there in 1938, around that time, they were not going over and setting up an altar and worshiping Baal like we see in 1 Kings. They weren't doing that overt type of worship of these evil spirits. But it is clear that their worship of the one true God had been replaced by worship of false gods. And these ancient evil spirits, which we've been talking about, they are crafty, they are clever, they adjust, and they morph to the societies that they're in. They adjust to societies in different ages. Right now, around the world, the way that there is idol worship, there is overt and direct idol worship within some countries all around the world. Not a lot of that in the U.S. Not a lot of that. That does not mean we do not have idolatry and the worship of false gods in this country. It means that it takes on a different form. It looks different. This week, in looking at these various stories through history, which are similar to Obadiah in 1 Kings 18, I came across a story that I wasn't familiar with at all, of Andre and Magda Trosme. I think that's how you say their last name. I wasn't familiar, but their actions are very similar here, and it was a story that I felt like is really worthy of praise, of emulation, of hearing about. And so I found a short video that we're going to watch, which tells their story. So if you want to go ahead and put that up there, Luke, we'll watch it.
Andre Trocme was born in France in 1907. He served as pastor and spiritual leader of the Protestant community at Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, which aided and saved thousands of Jews over the course of World War II. In June 1940, following the German occupation of France, France was divided into two main areas: the northeastern zone, which was to remain under direct German control, and the southwestern Free Zone, known as Vichy France, legally governed out of the city of Vichy by a regime that collaborated with the Nazis, headed by Marshal Philippe Pétain. Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, where Trocme lived, was included in the Free Zone. On June 23, 1940, the day after the signing of the French Armistice Agreement and establishment of the Vichy government, Trocme insisted to his community that it was their Christian duty to resist violence. "We will do so," he said, "without fear, but also without pride and without hate." The town and its surroundings became a rare point of refuge for Jews, French citizens, and foreign nationals alike, fleeing the Nazis and their French collaborators. In 1942, when deportations from France to extermination camps began, Trocme begged his community to lend assistance to any Jew requesting refuge. In short order, hundreds of Jews arrived at the town. Some found permanent refuge in the surrounding hills, while others were given temporary refuge until they could cross the border, mostly to neighboring Switzerland, which was neutral. Despite the great danger, Jews resided with town residents and nearby farmers, in public buildings and in children's homes. Aided by locals, Some of the Jews were taken by foot on dangerous journeys to the Swiss border. The community members of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon engaged in rescue efforts out of a belief that it was their Christian duty. In personally acting to rescue Jews and create places of refuge for them, Reverend André Trocmé and wife Magda were personal examples for their community members, encouraging them to further rescue Jews. The rescue activity wasn't organized. According to Magda's testimony, each community member acted on their own. Each individual did whatever they felt necessary. If we'd had an organization, we would have failed. My husband certainly had an important influence, but that doesn't mean he knew about everything. It was a general consensus. Magda was an active participant in creating and maintaining the town as a place of refuge for Jews. She located families willing to take in Jewish refugees and prepared local schools in order to receive and register the refugees. The Vichy authorities suspected what was occurring in the town and demanded the pastor cease his activity. André unequivocally refused, saying, "These people came here for help and for shelter. I am their shepherd. A shepherd does not forsake his flock. I do not know what a Jew is. I know only human beings." And so, the Trocmés continued encouraging the local residents to harbor Jews, even under threat of the authorities, and even after November 1942, when Germany entered the Free Zone and all of France fell under direct German rule. In February 1943, André Trocmé was arrested, together with two of his colleagues, the Reverend Edouard Théis and the teacher Roger d'Arcissac, and interned at the Saint-Paul-de-Joux camp near Limoges. During 5 weeks of arrest, Trocmé was put under great pressure to sign a statement promising to obey all government orders. He did not succumb to the pressure, but after his release, was forced to go underground. His absence, however, did not deter the residents of Le Chambon, who continued harboring Jews until the end of the war. Daniel Trocmé, André's nephew, also took part in the rescue activities, heeding his uncle's request to manage a boarding school for Jewish refugee children in Le Chambon. In August 1943, he was arrested and sent to a detention camp, and then later deported to Majdanek, where he died of an illness. On January 5, 1971, Yad Vashem recognized the Reverend André Trocmé as a righteous among the nations. Magda Trocmé was recognized on May 14, 1984, and Danielle Trocmé on March 18, 1976. 32 other residents of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon were awarded the title. And in 1990, Yad Vashem presented the village with a special diploma of honor in tribute to their humane conduct during the war. According to estimates, some 3,000 to 5,000 Jews were rescued thanks to the efforts of the Le Chambon-sur-Lignon community, headed by André and Magda Trocmé.
I think stories like this are ones that are important for us to know about. They're important for us to tell others about. They're important, as this, I think, really clearly showed. This was because of and out of faith in Jesus and Christian ethics that actions like this were taken. So here's what I hope we'll leave with today on this sermon. At the beginning of the sermon, I asked, how does a people lose its way? How do hearts stray from God? How does one's love grow cold? How does one accommodate and allow the worship of false gods? And I think it's by not following the instructions of Deuteronomy 6 and Deuteronomy 11. We are tasked with taking the things we know and we believe about God and passing them on from one generation to the next. That's what we are supposed to be about. The origin of all these courageous actions that we looked at today were rooted in the faith of the one true God. They were believed to be true, and then out of faith they were lived out. We cannot pass on what we do not possess. We should never assume that these things will be known by the next generation. We must live them, we must speak them, teach them, we must give testimony about them, we must praise the works of others that we see who have done these things. So failing to do so is a contributing factor to a people losing its way, to hearts straying, to hearts growing cold. It's not the complete cause. There's other factors here. we're not talking about today, but I think this is a very big one. The nation of Israel repeatedly failed to do this, repeatedly failed to pass from one generation to the next the things they had learned and witnessed. And this danger is also very clearly present now. So estimates are that for kids who grow up in church, approximately 66% of them leave their faith or the faith of their parents when they get to college. Why is that? In the account of 1 Kings, we see that Obadiah lived out what God had called his people to do, and Ahab did not. And we don't have the whole picture here. We know about Ahab and his father. We know that from Omri to Ahab, these truths were not passed on, and Ahab did not learn these from him. We don't know about Obadiah and his family. This is the only time we see him. It's a very little snapshot of his life. But I would say that I make the assumption that his following of Yahweh, his protection of other lives, wasn't something that just spontaneously came to him one day. Not something that was just like, oh, this seems like a good idea, put my life in danger in order to protect these other people. He could have very easily gone along with what was being done within the government all around him. Most of the people did. So I think that Obadiah was probably taught this from his youth. This was something that he knew to be true, that you have to love and serve the one true God. And in loving and serving the one true God, you're going to take actions, even at your own risk, to protect others. So when the time of testing came, it wasn't something that he just came up with, but something that he lived out because it had been taught to him. The clear principle that we see in Scripture is that those who love the Lord and serve him seek to protect and to preserve the lives who are in danger, the lives of those who are in danger, even at the risk of their own lives. And I think this is a vital characteristic of the Christian faith. It's something that's been lived out over and over again over the centuries. It's something that's being lived out around the world right now. It's something we must know, we must teach, and we must pass on to those who come after us. Well, you guys. All right. We're going to conclude there, and we're going to enter into a time of worship and a time of communion. During this first song, everybody's welcome to come up and get the elements, and then we're going to have a time of quiet prayer and contemplation, and then we'll be partaking together of the elements. So I'm going to welcome the worship team up, and we'll continue on.